A chemical company sells poison gas to Germany in 1938. The scandal breaks. Congressional hearings threaten to destroy the company, but instead of collapsing, Murkoff Corporation learns something valuable about survival. Public outrage has a short memory, and profits cure most sins. The company pays fines, issues apologies, and waits. Within a decade, they're back in business with government contracts, this time selling something more valuable than weaponized chemicals. They're selling the technology to weaponize human consciousness itself. This is the story of Murkoff Corporation. We're tracing the complete history of an institution that turned psychological destruction into profit across nearly a century. From their origins as a chemical manufacturer willing to arm fascists through their post-war recruitment of Nazi scientists, into Cold War mind control experiments that industrialized trauma all the way to modern operations where corporate evil wears the mask of charitable mental health services. By the end, you'll understand how a single company weaponized every major advance in psychology and neuroscience, how institutional structures protect atrocity better than any cover-up, and why Murkoff represents the most dangerous kind of evil, the kind that operates in plain sight, with legal protection and government funding. If something in this video resonates with you, drop a comment about which part connected or what detail made you pause. You can also suggest topics for future deep dives into game lore. Building this community happens through these conversations, and seeing what strikes a chord with you shapes where we go next. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Scandal is Survivable. Picture America in 1938. The Great Depression still has its grip on the economy. Europe is sliding toward war, and a chemical company called Murkoff is making business decisions that will define its character for the next century. Murkoff starts as a chemical manufacturer, producing industrial compounds for various applications. The specifics of their early legitimate business are less important than what they're willing to do when opportunity presents itself. German military forces need disengagement, a chemical weapon descended from the poison gases that defined World War I's horror. Disengagement is a pulmonary agent that causes fluid buildup in the lungs, drowning victims from the inside over hours or days of agony. International treaties prohibit its manufacture and sale. Murkoff sells it anyway. The transactions are conducted through intermediaries and shell companies designed to obscure the paper trail. Murkoff executives understand they're arming a regime that's already showing clear fascist tendencies, already persecuting Jewish populations, already preparing for territorial expansion through military force. They sell the chemicals anyway because the profit margin is exceptional, and because international law enforcement for this kind of commerce is weak enough to make the risk acceptable. The scandal breaks in late 1938, when investigative journalists trace shipments back to Murkoff's facilities. Congressional hearings are convened. Murkoff executives are questioned about their business practices and their willingness to arm a regime that's increasingly hostile to American interests. The company faces potential criminal charges, massive fines, and destruction of their reputation severe enough to end their operations entirely. What happens next establishes a pattern that will define Murkoff for decades. Instead of collapsing under the weight of scandal, they weather it. They issue carefully worded apologies that acknowledge wrongdoing without admitting criminal intent. They pay substantial fines while maintaining these were rogue employees acting without board approval. They promise reformed business practices and enhanced oversight, and they wait for public attention to move on to newer crises. The strategy works because institutions have advantages individuals don't. A person caught selling weapons to fascists becomes a pariah. A corporation caught doing the same thing pays penalties, restructures leadership, and continues operating under the same name with largely the same personnel in slightly different positions. The corporate form provides a kind of immortality and immunity that individual criminals can't access. By 1949, Murkoff has fully rehabilitated its public image. The DIFUS gene scandal is remembered by some, but the company has spent a decade demonstrating compliance with regulations, contributing to community initiatives, and positioning itself as a respectable American business. When the Central Intelligence Agency begins looking for private contractors to assist with sensitive operations, Murkoff is among the companies considered suitable partners. The CIA's interest comes from Murkoff's specific expertise with chemical compounds and their willingness, already proven through the DIFUS gene affair, to operate in morally questionable territory when profit and institutional protection are offered. The agency is ramping up operations that will become MK-Ultra, the sprawling mind control research program that will define Cold War psychological warfare. They need partners who can provide pharmaceutical support, laboratory facilities, and plausible deniability when experiments cross ethical lines that government facilities can't officially approach. A Bradley Avellanos proposes cooperation to Murkoff's board on April 30th, 1949. The initial pitch involves chemical refinement for heroin, interested in both for its potential as an incapacitant and for its use in covert operations funding. The proposal emphasizes financial opportunity alongside implications of legal protection. Partnering with the CIA means Murkoff's operations will be shielded by classification and national security justifications. Activities that might otherwise trigger investigation become untouchable because they're conducted under government contract for purposes that can't be discussed publicly. Murkoff's board accepts the proposal. The decision is framed as patriotic service, helping America win the Cold War through any means necessary. The reality is more pragmatic. Partnership offers three things: substantial funding streams independent of market fluctuations, legal protection that makes prosecution for questionable activities nearly impossible, and access to research that could produce patents and products with immense commercial value once declassified. This partnership transforms Murkoff from a chemical manufacturer with a checkered past into something more dangerous: a corporation with government backing, conducting research that exists in the gap between legal and visible. They're not operating outside the law exactly. They're operating in spaces where law doesn't effectively reach because classification and national security claims oversight. The relationship with the CIA introduces Murkoff to Dr. Rudolf Gustav Wernicke. Wernicke is a German scientist who emigrated to the United States in 1949 as part of Operation Paperclip, the program that brought Nazi scientists to America in exchange for their expertise. Wernicke had been developing something called the morphogenic engine during his work for the Third Reich, technology designed to induce and manipulate dream states for purposes of psychological control. Operation Paperclip is one of the great moral compromises of the post-war period. The American government decided that Nazi scientists' expertise was too valuable to leave in Soviet hands, so they offered immunity and new identities to researchers whose work had contributed to concentration camps, human experimentation, and industrial-scale atrocity. The bargain was simple: give us your knowledge and we'll overlook what you did to acquire it. Wernicke's integration into the American military-industrial complex is rapid. His morphogenic engine research becomes the foundation for programs Murkoff will develop over the following decades. The device works by manipulating subjects' sleep patterns and dream states through targeted stimulation, creating conditions where the boundary between reality and hallucination becomes permeable enough that psychological programming can be embedded at levels beyond conscious resistance. The morphogenic engine represents a technological approach to mind control that complements the chemical and behavioral techniques the CIA is exploring through MKUltra. Instead of relying solely on drugs or sensory deprivation or torture to break down subjects' psychological defenses, Wernicke's technology accesses consciousness during the vulnerable periods when the brain is already in altered states. Dreams become the medium through which new beliefs, fears, and compulsions can be installed directly into the unconscious architecture that shapes waking behavior. Murkoff sees immediate commercial and strategic applications. A device that can manipulate dream states and implant psychological content could revolutionize psychiatry, education, behavior modification, and a dozen other fields once the technology is sufficiently refined. The fact that refining it requires human experimentation on subjects who haven't provided meaningful consent is a problem that government partnership solves. Classification makes the research invisible, and national security justifications make objections unpatriotic. By the mid-1950s, Murkoff is fully integrated into the network of companies, universities, and hospitals conducting MKUltra research. They provide pharmaceutical compounds, chemical refinement, and laboratory facilities. They're also beginning to develop their own research programs, building on government-funded work while positioning themselves to retain intellectual property rights to discoveries that could be commercialized once the classified period ends. This creates a dynamic where Murkoff benefits, regardless of whether specific experiments succeed or fail. Successful research produces patents and techniques they can monetize. Failed research gets funded by budgets without impacting Murkoff's bottom line. The risks are socialized through government contracts, while the profits are privatized through corporate structure. Subjects who are harmed or killed in experiments become classified casualties, whose deaths can't be investigated because acknowledging the programs would compromise national security. The relationship brings Murkoff into contact with Dr. Hendrik Joliet Easterman in 1954. Olivier W. Barancik, working within Murkoff's expanding research operations, reaches out to Easterman with an invitation to meet researchers in Los Alamos. Easterman is a psychologist and psychiatrist whose work on breaking resistant subjects has attracted attention from people interested in military and intelligence applications. Easterman's background reveals someone shaped by childhood abuse into pursuing external validation through achievement. His mother's constant criticism created narcissistic vulnerability, a personality structure where self-worth depends entirely on accomplishment and recognition from authority figures. Easterman accumulated degrees and research credentials as armor against the internal voice, insisting he was inadequate. His work involved prisoners and psychiatric patients, populations whose consent was legally meaningless, allowing him to develop techniques for psychological destruction without the ethical constraints that would have prevented similar research on volunteers with genuine agency. Murkoff recognizes in Easterman exactly what they need: brilliant psychological expertise combined with willingness to harm subjects when achievement requires it. Easterman sees in Murkoff the resources to prove theories that other institutions are too ethically constrained to let him pursue. The partnership forms naturally because both parties understand the transaction. Murkoff provides unlimited research budgets and human subjects. Easterman provides techniques for systematic psychological destruction. Neither party needs to pretend they're primarily motivated by humanitarian concerns. Over the next several years, Easterman consults on Murkoff projects while maintaining academic positions that give his work legitimacy. He's refining approaches to psychological conditioning, testing theories about how minds can be broken and rebuilt, documenting which techniques produce permanent changes versus temporary compliance. His research feeds into broader programs while positioning him as an expert in areas Murkoff is increasingly interested in: industrial-scale behavior modification. Wernicke's morphogenic engine and Easterman's psychological techniques represent complementary approaches. Wernicke provides technological intervention in consciousness. Easterman provides the behavioral frameworks for interpreting and directing what subjects experience during those interventions. Together, they're developing a comprehensive system for reprogramming human beings that combines neurology, psychology, pharmacology, and behavioral conditioning into an integrated assault on identity itself. The research is producing results disturbing enough that even CIA overseers occasionally raise concerns. Subjects are emerging with permanent psychological damage, memory loss so severe they can't function independently, personality changes that make them unrecognizable to family. Some die from complications, others develop psychiatric conditions severe enough that they require permanent institutionalization. The success rate, measured by whether subjects can be reliably programmed to perform desired behaviors, is low enough that the programs should probably be terminated as failures. But termination would mean abandoning the investment already made and admitting the human cost was wasted. Instead, the programs continue on the logic that breakthrough might be one more experiment away, that the knowledge being gained justifies continued research regardless of casualties, and that subjects are expendable populations whose suffering serves national security purposes. Murkoff adopts this reasoning completely because it aligns perfectly with their business model. Keep researching as long as funding continues, and let someone else worry about the ethical implications decades later when documents are finally declassified. By the late 1950s, Murkoff is ready to propose something ambitious. They want a dedicated facility where hundreds of subjects can be processed through systematic conditioning programs designed to create reliable sleeper agents. They want to prove that psychological warfare can be industrialized, that breaking and rebuilding human consciousness can become a manufacturing process with consistent quality control. The proposal that emerges is called Project Lathe. The acronym stands for Latent Agency Therapy, originally limbic aggression therapy, and the metaphor is clear. Subjects will be placed on a lathe and shaped through systematic application of pressure and technique until they match desired specifications. The project will require a facility large enough to house subjects, staff, and the elaborate theatrical environments Easterman insists are necessary for effective conditioning. It will require legal cover to acquire subjects without triggering investigations. And it will require absolute secrecy because what they're planning to do would violate every ethical standard for human research if it were conducted visibly. Murkoff has all these elements in place. They have CIA partnership, providing funding and classification. They have Wernicke's technology and Easterman's expertise. They have legal structures that make them difficult to prosecute. What they need now is location and victims. The location they choose is the Arizona desert, remote enough that operations won't be observed by civilians, close enough to urban areas that recruiting subjects won't be logistically impossible, large enough that they can build an underground facility with multiple separate trial environments. The above-ground structures are designed to look like a research campus, ordinary enough that aerial surveillance won't reveal anything unusual. The real facility is below ground, where screaming doesn't carry, and where architectural design can create environments that feel real enough to subjects that they'll accept them as genuine even while knowing, on some level, that they're in an artificial space. The facility will be called Sinala. Construction begins in 1957. The underground construction is extensive, carving out space for multiple trial environments, living quarters for subjects and staff, medical facilities, and the control rooms where Easterman and his researchers will monitor every moment of what happens in the trials. The design is inspired by theater and theme parks, creating spaces that look like police stations, orphanages, factories, and other civilian environments, but that can be manipulated in ways real locations can't. The first iteration of Project Lathe fails catastrophically. Trials result in 171 people dead or injured, Murkoff staff who get caught in violence they weren't prepared for, and visitors whose presence at the facility during the disaster suggests either oversight failures or deliberate exposure of observers to demonstrate the program's effects. The immediate recommendation is that Project Lathe be halted indefinitely. The casualty rate is unacceptable even by the standards of classified research programs. The techniques being tested are producing psychotic breaks, murderous violence, and systemic failures that indicate the theoretical frameworks are flawed. Continuing would mean accepting that hundreds more people might die without producing actionable intelligence or reliable conditioning methods. Easterman refuses to accept termination. He analyzes the failures and concludes the problem wasn't the underlying theory, but execution. The first iteration used insufficient psychological preparation. Subjects weren't properly broken down before conditioning began. The trial environments weren't refined enough to create the immersive experiences necessary for deep programming. The prime assets, the individuals tasked with applying psychological pressure during trials, weren't selected carefully enough for the specific psychiatric profiles that make someone effective at systematic cruelty. Easterman proposes Project Lathe 2, a revised version that addresses every identified failure point. Subjects will undergo more extensive preconditioning. The sleep room, a space dedicated to pharmaceutical intervention and recorded messaging, will be used to create baseline psychological vulnerability before subjects ever enter trial environments. Prime assets will be selected for specific mental illnesses and personality disorders that make them useful. Antisocial personality disorder for subjects who need methodical violence without emotional interference. Dissociative identity disorder for subjects who need unpredictable maternal horror. Sadism for subjects who need terror that feels personal and malicious. Easterman pitches the revised program to higher-ups at Murkoff and Los Alamos on August 25, 1958. The presentation emphasizes lessons learned from the first iteration's failures and the probability that the refined approach will produce the industrial-scale conditioning that the original proposal promised. Murkoff's leadership approves Project Lathe 2, authorizing construction of additional trial environments and allocation of resources for recruiting the hundreds of subjects the expanded program will require. The decision to continue after such catastrophic failure reveals something crucial about how institutions operate. A rational evaluation would conclude that programs producing this many casualties with this little success should be terminated immediately. But institutions don't operate on rational evaluation alone. They operate on sunk cost fallacies, on reluctance to admit failure, on pressure to justify investments already made, and on the reality that people making continuation decisions aren't the ones who will face consequences if future iterations fail just as catastrophically. For Murkoff specifically, continuing makes perfect business sense. They're not bearing the full costs of failure. Funding absorbs much of the expense. The classified nature of the research means negative publicity won't damage their public reputation. The knowledge gained, even from failed experiments, contributes to proprietary techniques they can commercialize later. And abandoning the project would mean writing off years of investment and losing their position as the leading private contractor for psychological warfare research. By September 1958, Murkoff is distributing memorandums that classify the different archetypes of the experimental population at Sinala. These archetypes represent categories of people considered ideal subjects, individuals with trauma histories that make them vulnerable to specific conditioning approaches, people with minimal social connections who won't be missed if they disappear for months or die during experiments, populations whose legal status or social position means their complaints won't be taken seriously, if they survive, and try to report what happened. The memorandums are chilling in their clinical detachment. They discuss human beings as raw material to be sorted and allocated to appropriate trials based on their psychological vulnerabilities and physical capabilities. Heavy X-Pop designates subjects who've already been through trial processes, whose minds and bodies have been damaged enough that they can't return to normal populations, but who can still serve useful purposes within the facility's ecosystem. These are people who've been destroyed so thoroughly they're functionally trapped at Sinala even without physical restraints, whose only remaining option is to accept whatever role Murkoff assigns them in exchange for continued survival. By 1959, Project Lathe 2 is fully operational. The facility is processing subjects through multiple trial environments simultaneously. Easterman has assembled his team of prime assets, each selected for psychological conditions that make them perfect instruments of specific kinds of trauma. Each prime asset operates within a trial environment designed specifically for their psychology and skill set. The trials are designed to be comprehensive assaults on identity. Subjects, now called reagents, are processed through environments where every element is calculated to produce specific psychological states. The architecture creates disorientation. The lighting prevents normal circadian rhythms. The pharmaceutical interventions alter neurochemistry in ways that make subjects vulnerable to suggestion and unable to form reliable memories. The prime assets provide human embodiment of institutional power, demonstrating that resistance is futile and that survival requires obedience regardless of what's being demanded. The sleep room becomes central to the entire operation. Between trial sessions, reagents return to this space where they're subjected to recorded messages from Easterman that reframe their experiences. The broadcasts use sophisticated linguistic techniques to bypass critical thinking, embedding suggestions that become harder to resist each time they're repeated. The pharmaceutical interventions in the sleep room include compounds that enhance memory consolidation, ensuring that the interpretive frameworks Easterman provides are encoded more deeply than the raw trauma of what reagents experience during trials. This creates a feedback loop where trauma and interpretation reinforce each other. Reagents experience horror in the trials. The sleep room tells them how to understand that horror in ways that serve Murkoff's purposes. The drugs ensure those interpretations are consolidated into long-term memory structures. When reagents return to trials, they're slightly more broken, slightly more willing to accept Murkoff's framing, slightly less capable of maintaining the beliefs and identity they had before entering the facility. Over months of processing, reagents are systematically destroyed. Their sense of self fragments under repeated assaults. Their moral frameworks collapse when they're forced to commit acts that can't be reconciled with being a good person. Their ability to form memories becomes compromised by pharmaceutical interventions and trauma-induced dissociation. They learn that appealing to authority is futile because authority is what's hurting them. They learn that resistance brings punishment more severe than compliance. They learn that the only way to reduce suffering is to become what Murkoff wants them to be: programmable agents without meaningful internal resistance to commands. The success rate is still relatively low. Many reagents die during processing from suicide, complications from pharmaceutical interventions, or violence during trials that escalates beyond prime assets control. Many more emerge so damaged they're transferred to the heavy X-Pop category. People who've been destroyed beyond usefulness as sleeper agents, but who can serve as environmental population within the facility or as test subjects for secondary experiments. Only a fraction emerge as successfully conditioned agents who can pass for normal in civilian contexts while carrying programming that can be activated through specific triggers. But Murkoff considers even this low success rate acceptable because the research itself is valuable. They're documenting which techniques produce which results, refining their understanding of how minds break and what kinds of breaks are reversible versus permanent. They're developing expertise that no other institution possesses, creating proprietary knowledge that can be applied to future programs or commercialized once classified restrictions are lifted. The moral calculus is purely utilitarian in the most grotesque sense. Hundreds of people are being destroyed, but the knowledge gained might enable influencing millions through refined techniques. Individual suffering is terrible, but institutional benefit outweighs individual costs in frameworks where institutions matter more than persons. The ends justify the means when the means can be classified and the ends can be framed as national security. This is where Murkoff's character becomes fully visible. They're not operating from ideology or belief in particular political systems. They're opportunistic institutional predators who identified that psychological warfare research offered profitable opportunities with minimal accountability. They're willing to work with anyone, fund any research, destroy any number of people as long as doing so advances their position and protects their profits. The Difos gene scandal taught them that institutions can survive what would destroy individuals. The CIA partnership taught them that government backing makes atrocity invisible. Project Lathe is them applying both lessons simultaneously. By the early 1960s, Project Lathe has processed hundreds of reagents through Sinala's trials. The facility operates continuously, recruiting new subjects as previous cohorts are either successfully programmed, destroyed beyond usefulness, or killed during conditioning. Easterman has refined his techniques to the point where he can predict with reasonable accuracy which subjects will break in which ways, which trials will be most effective for specific psychological profiles, which pharmaceutical compounds produce desired states versus complications. The prime assets have become frighteningly effective at their roles. They've processed so many reagents that the systematic cruelty has become routine, their psychiatric conditions channeled into repeatable procedures that require minimal oversight. The facility itself has evolved based on operational experience. Trial environments are constantly being refined, architectural elements adjusted to produce maximum psychological impact. The orphanage adds elements that trigger regression more reliably. The police station's layout is modified to create more opportunities for ambush and capture that demonstrate futility of resistance. The docks expands its heroin refinery operations, giving subjects access to drugs that some use for escape, creating dependencies that Murkoff can exploit for additional control. Medical staff at Sinala have become desensitized to horror that should have driven them to report the facility to authorities. They're treating injuries from electrical burns, chemical exposure, blunt force trauma, sexual assault, and psychological damage so severe it manifests in physical symptoms. They're watching people deteriorate across weeks or months, seeing vibrant individuals enter the facility, and broken shells emerge. They're documenting casualties and filing reports that disappear into classified archives where they can't be used as evidence for prosecution. This desensitization represents one of the most disturbing aspects of institutional atrocity. The staff at Sinala didn't join Murkoff planning to participate in systematic torture. They accepted jobs that seemed legitimate, positions at a research facility conducting classified work for government purposes. But the gradual normalization of horror, the daily exposure to suffering that became routine, the institutional messaging that framed their work as necessary and patriotic, all combined to make participating in atrocity feel like just doing their jobs. This is how institutions commit systematic evil without requiring that everyone involved be individually monstrous. Most Murkoff employees at Sinala aren't sadists like Coyle or psychopaths like Franco. They're ordinary people who've been absorbed into a system that gradually normalized behaviors they would have found horrifying if presented all at once. They rationalize their participation through compartmentalization, through focusing on their specific technical tasks rather than the broader context of what those tasks contribute to, through trusting that institutional authorities have made ethical determinations they don't need to second guess. By the mid-1960s, Project Lathe has produced enough successfully conditioned agents that the CIA is beginning to deploy them in field operations. The specifics remain classified, but the program has proven the concept. Industrial-scale psychological conditioning can create sleeper agents who function normally in civilian contexts while carrying programming that can be activated through specific triggers. The success rate is still low enough that producing each functional agent requires processing dozens of subjects through trials. Murkoff is positioned perfectly. They've become the premier private contractor for psychological warfare research, holding expertise no other institution can match. They're positioning themselves to monetize the knowledge gained once Cold War programs end and once enough time has passed that the horrific origins of their techniques can be obscured through sanitized rebranding. This is where we need to pause and recognize the full scope of what Murkoff represents. They're not an anomaly. They're the natural evolution of what happens when corporate structures are allowed to operate in domains that should require strict ethical oversight. When profit motives are combined with activities that have immense potential for harm, and when institutional forms provide immunity from consequences that would attach to individuals committing identical acts. Chapter 2: Mount Massive and the Perfect Host. The asylum sits in the Colorado mountains like a wound that never properly healed. Mount Massive Asylum was constructed in the late 1800s, one of those massive institutional buildings that Victorian America built to warehouse people society didn't want to acknowledge. By the time Murkoff begins operating there in the 1960s, the asylum has spent decades cycling through reforms that never quite worked, housing populations that mental health systems failed, accumulating the kind of institutional history that leaves psychic residue in the architecture itself. Murkoff doesn't buy Mount Massive because they need another psychiatric hospital. They buy it because the isolated location, the existing infrastructure for housing captive populations, and the legal frameworks that make psychiatric patients effectively invisible create perfect conditions for research that require human subjects with minimal rights and even less oversight. The partnership happens quietly through subsidiary companies designed to obscure Murkoff's direct involvement. On paper, a charitable foundation dedicated to mental health reform eventually purchases the aging facility in 2009. But Murkoff's control begins decades earlier with plans to modernize treatment approaches for patients with severe psychiatric conditions. The local community welcomes this development because Mount Massive has been deteriorating for years, and the promise of investment suggests jobs and improved care for vulnerable populations. What actually happens is that Murkoff transforms Mount Massive into a research facility where the visible psychiatric hospital functions as cover for underground laboratories, conducting experiments that would be impossible to justify if conducted openly. The above-ground asylum operates as a functioning mental health facility, providing minimal care to a patient population that serves dual purposes as both subjects for legitimate psychiatric research and as potential recruits for programs happening in spaces visitors never see. The underground laboratories are where Murkoff's real interests lie. They excavate extensive space beneath the asylum, constructing facilities that include the morphogenic engine itself, medical equipment for monitoring subjects during experiments, and containment systems for what they're planning to create. The construction happens gradually across several years, hidden from public view through classification and through the simple reality that nobody pays close attention to what happens inside psychiatric institutions as long as scandals don't break into public awareness. Wernicke oversees the construction of the morphogenic engine assembler. The device represents decades of refinement since his original work for the Third Reich, incorporating advances in neuroscience, pharmacology, and nanotechnology that weren't available during his Nazi years. The basics principle remains the same. Subjects are placed in controlled environments where their consciousness is manipulated through dream state induction, allowing access to psychological and neurological processes that conscious awareness would resist. But the application has evolved. Wernicke isn't just trying to implant suggestions or create conditioned responses anymore. He's attempting something far more ambitious, creating a host for the Walrider. The Walrider is a nano swarm, billions of microscopic machines that can function collectively as a single entity when properly directed. The individual nanites are too small to see, but when aggregated in sufficient numbers and organized through coherent control signals, they can manifest physical force, move through solid barriers, and interact with the material world in ways that seem to violate normal physics. The military applications are obvious: an invisible weapon that can infiltrate any space, that requires no conventional ammunition or fuel, that can be directed through thought alone, would revolutionize warfare and intelligence operations. But the Walrider can't be controlled through traditional computer interfaces. The computational requirements for coordinating billions of independent nanites in real time exceed what any conventional system can handle. The solution Wernicke has developed requires human consciousness as the processing substrate. A person in the right psychological state, experiencing lucid dreaming where they maintain awareness within dream environments while their higher cognitive functions remain partially active, can provide the kind of distributed processing that allows the nanoswarm to function as coherent entity. The challenge is finding hosts who can achieve and maintain the necessary psychological state. Normal dreaming won't work because consciousness isn't sufficiently engaged. Normal waking consciousness won't work because the rational mind can't process the kind of distributed awareness the Walrider requires. What's needed is someone balanced at the edge of complete madness, someone whose mind has been damaged enough to access consciousness states most people never experience, but not so damaged that coherent thought becomes impossible. This is where Mount Massive's patient population becomes invaluable. Murkoff isn't just conducting experiments. They're creating the psychological damage necessary to produce potential hosts. Patients are subjected to the morphogenic engine therapy, exposed to recordings designed to induce specific trauma responses, given pharmaceutical compounds that alter brain chemistry in ways that make madness more accessible. The process creates physical deformities as the nanite precursor molecules are injected and assembled by subjects' own cells. Most subjects develop lesions and tumor-like growths as their bodies reject the nanite production process. The few who are receptive begin manifesting the alterations Wernicke is looking for. The experiments at Mount Massive parallel what Easterman is doing at Sinala, but with a different objective. Easterman is breaking people to make them controllable. Wernicke is breaking people to make them conduits for something that's neither human nor machine, but a fusion that requires destroying the boundary between consciousness and technology. By 1959, Wernicke is experimenting on reagents who completed Project Lathe's rebirth protocol, using an early version of the morphogenic engine in the asylum's underground laboratories. These are people who've already been processed through Sinala's trials, who've already had their identities systematically destroyed, who've proven they can survive psychological trauma severe enough to kill most subjects. They're perfect candidates for the next stage of experimentation because they've demonstrated the kind of resilience and malleability that Wernicke's process requires. Some of these reagents are transferred to Mount Massive specifically for morphogenic engine testing. Others are patients who were already institutionalized and who Murkoff identified as having the psychiatric profiles that make them suitable subjects. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary participation has become meaningless at this point. Nobody being placed in the morphogenic engine has provided informed consent. Nobody understands what's actually being done to them. They're told they're receiving advanced therapy for their conditions, experimental treatments that might succeed where conventional approaches failed. The reality is that they're being used to test whether human consciousness can merge with nanotechnology to create a weapon Murkoff plans to sell to military and intelligence agencies for applications they'll never disclose to the hosts whose minds are being sacrificed for the research. The failure rate is catastrophic, even by Murkoff's standards. Most subjects exposed to the morphogenic engine develop tumors so aggressive that they die within weeks. Others experience psychotic breaks so severe that they become catatonic or violently uncontrollable. The physical toll of nanite production on human bodies proves worse than Wernicke anticipated, with subjects' cellular structures unable to handle the assembly processes without massive damage to surrounding tissues. But Murkoff continues the experiments because each failure provides data. They're documenting which genetic factors predict tolerance for nanite production, which psychiatric conditions correlate with ability to achieve lucid dream states, which pharmaceutical interventions improve success rates versus accelerating deterioration. The knowledge being accumulated represents decades of lead time over any competitor who might attempt similar research, creating intellectual property worth millions even if Project Walrider never produces a functional weapon. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Mount Massive operates this dual existence. The visible asylum provides psychiatric care that ranges from neglectful to actively harmful, with patients warehoused in overcrowded wards and staff overworked to the point where meaningful treatment becomes impossible. The underground laboratories conduct experiments that represent the cutting edge of neuroscience and nanotechnology, with unlimited budgets and no ethical constraints beyond avoiding scandals so egregious they'd trigger federal investigation. The separation between these two realities is maintained through compartmentalization. Most staff at the above-ground asylum have no idea what's happening in the underground laboratories. They see patients who are selected for special programs and transferred to restricted areas, but they're told these are advanced treatment protocols that require security clearance to access. The few staff members who do have access to the underground are either true believers in Murkoff's mission or pragmatic careerists who've decided that career advancement justifies participating in research they know crosses ethical lines. Wernicke himself is aging but remains obsessively dedicated to perfecting the morphogenic engine. He's spent decades on this project, first under Nazi funding, then under CIA partnership, now under Murkoff's corporate umbrella. His life's work hinges on proving that consciousness can be weaponized through technology, that human minds can be transformed into control systems for weapons that will reshape how power operates in the modern world. The cost in human subjects is irrelevant to him. They're means toward ends that justify any sacrifice as long as someone else is making it. By the 1980s, MKUltra has officially ended. Congressional investigations exposed elements of the program, creating scandals that forced the CIA to publicly terminate the research and destroy documentation. But Murkoff's work continues because the corporate structure provides insulation from government accountability. They're no longer operating under direct CIA contracts. They're conducting private research that happens to align with government interests, creating plausible deniability for both parties. This transition from government-funded to privately funded research marks an important evolution in Murkoff's business model. They're no longer dependent on agencies that might face political pressure to terminate programs. They're self-sustaining through corporate profits and through intellectual property they've accumulated from decades of classified research. The knowledge gained from MK Ultra and Project Lathe and the morphogenic engine experiments represents competitive advantages worth more than any single contract. Mount Massive continues processing subjects through the morphogenic engine throughout the 80s and 90s. The facility becomes something of an open secret in psychiatric circles, a place where the most treatment-resistant patients get sent when other institutions have exhausted their options. Families desperate for help with relatives whose mental illness makes them dangerous or unmanageable sign committal papers that transfer legal responsibility to Mount Massive. Courts order psychiatric evaluation and treatment for criminals whose cases involve mental health questions. Homeless individuals with severe psychiatric conditions are picked up during sweeps and processed through systems that eventually route them to Mount Massive when their symptoms prove too challenging for underfunded public facilities. What none of these referring parties understand is that sending someone to Mount Massive isn't treatment, it's recruitment. Murkoff evaluates every admission for their potential utility in ongoing research programs. Patients who display the right combination of psychiatric damage and physical resilience get flagged for deeper assessment. Those who meet criteria get transferred to underground programs where they'll be subjected to experiments designed to push them toward the psychological states Wernicke needs for his Walrider hosts. The patient population at Mount Massive develops its own horrible ecosystem. People who've been subjected to morphogenic engine therapy, but who survived without becoming functional hosts, become what Murkoff internally designates as variants. These are individuals so profoundly damaged by the experiments that they're no longer recognizably the people they were before treatment. Some develop massive physical alterations, their bodies twisted by nanite production processes that created tumors and growths instead of functional integration. Others manifest psychiatric symptoms so extreme that conventional diagnostic categories become meaningless. The variants remain at Mount Massive because releasing them would create visible evidence of what Murkoff has done. They're warehoused in the asylum's most secure wards, maintained through pharmaceutical restraint and minimal care, existing in states between life and death where personhood has been so thoroughly destroyed that even Murkoff's staff struggle to recognize them as human. They serve as environmental population, as test subjects for secondary experiments, and as warnings to newer patients about what happens when you don't cooperate with treatment protocols. This creates an atmosphere of pervasive terror throughout the visible portions of Mount Massive. Patients who aren't yet aware of the underground programs can sense that something is profoundly wrong. They hear screaming from restricted areas. They see patients who return from special programs transformed in ways that provoke instinctive horror. They notice that certain people disappear entirely, transferred to locations that staff refuse to discuss. The asylum becomes a place where the architecture itself seems malevolent, where every interaction with authority carries the implicit threat that you might be selected next for whatever happens in the spaces you're not allowed to see. The staff who work in these conditions without participating in underground programs experience their own forms of trauma. They're providing care in an environment they increasingly recognize is harming patients more than helping them. They're witnessing deterioration and death that doesn't match official explanations. They're being asked to maintain normalcy in circumstances that feel anything but normal. Some quit, burned out by the cognitive dissonance. Others adapt by emotionally detaching, by treating patients as cases rather than people, by narrowing their focus to specific tasks that allow them to avoid confronting the broader horror of what Mount Massive has become. A few staff members try to expose what's happening. They document injuries that don't match official records. They take photographs of conditions in restricted wards. They attempt to contact regulatory agencies or journalists with information about experiments they've witnessed or heard described. But Murkoff has extensive experience dealing with potential whistleblowers. The corporation uses legal threats, settlement agreements with non-disclosure clauses, and strategic deployment of psychiatric evaluations that question would-be whistleblowers' credibility. Staff members who persist in trying to expose Murkoff sometimes have accidents or develop sudden psychiatric conditions that require their own hospitalization. By the early 2000s, Mount Massive has processed thousands of subjects through morphogenic engine therapy across 4 decades of operation. The vast majority have died or been destroyed beyond any capacity for recovery. A small number have achieved partial integration with the nanite swarms, demonstrating brief moments where they could influence the Walrider's manifestation before their bodies collapsed under the strain. But Veronica hasn't yet produced a stable host, someone who can achieve full integration and maintain it long enough to demonstrate the Walrider's potential as a weaponized system. Murkoff's corporate leadership is growing impatient. They've invested massive resources in Project Walrider across decades without producing a functional product they can demonstrate to potential buyers. The research has generated valuable knowledge and numerous patents, but the core objective remains unfulfilled. Pressure builds on Veronica to either produce results or admit the project is a failure that should be terminated. Veronica responds by intensifying the experiments. More subjects are processed through the morphogenic engine simultaneously. The pharmaceutical interventions become more aggressive. The dream therapy recordings include content specifically designed to induce the kind of trauma that pushes subjects toward complete psychotic breaks. The underground laboratories become scenes of systematic brutality that makes earlier research look restrained by comparison. This escalation creates the conditions for what will eventually happen in September 2013, but we're not there yet. Before the Mount Massive incident, we need to understand how Murkoff evolved beyond its Cold War origins into a modern corporation that can present itself as a legitimate mental health provider, while conducting the same essential research it's been pursuing since the 1950s. Chapter 3: Corporate Evolution. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 should have ended Murkoff's relevance. The Cold War justifications that made MK-Ultra and Project Lathe fundable evaporated when the geopolitical threat they were designed to counter ceased to exist. Programs justified as necessary to compete with Soviet brainwashing techniques lost their rationale when there was no longer a Soviet Union to compete against. But Murkoff doesn't collapse. They adapt. The corporation recognizes that the techniques developed for creating sleeper agents have broader applications in a world where control is increasingly exercised through psychological influence rather than physical force. The same conditioning methods that can program someone to activate on command can be modified to shape consumer behavior, political beliefs, and social compliance. The pharmaceutical interventions refined through decades of experiments on unwilling subjects can be rebranded as medications for anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. The morphogenic engine technology can be positioned as advanced treatment for psychiatric conditions that resist conventional therapy. This rebranding represents Murkoff's genius for institutional survival. They don't abandon their core research. They translate it into language that makes it commercially viable and socially acceptable. The systematic destruction of identity becomes intensive residential treatment. The pharmaceutical interventions that rewire brain chemistry become medications prescribed by doctors who have no idea those compounds were originally developed to make subjects vulnerable to programming. The conditioning techniques become therapeutic protocols taught to counselors and social workers through training programs, Murkoff funds at universities. The knowledge flows from classified military research into civilian applications, without the public ever understanding the origins of what they're being sold. Murkoff becomes a major player in mental health services, operating facilities that provide legitimate care while also conducting research that continues the same basic trajectories established at Sinala and Mount Massive. The visible operations generate profits and provide cover. The classified operations continue advancing Murkoff's understanding of how to break and rebuild human consciousness. This dual structure is maintained through corporate complexity. Murkoff Corporation operates as a parent company with dozens of subsidiaries, each with different names and ostensibly different purposes. Some subsidiaries run psychiatric hospitals. Others develop pharmaceutical compounds. Some provide consulting services to correctional facilities and military contractors. Others conduct research through university partnerships that give their work academic legitimacy. The web of corporate relationships makes it nearly impossible to trace specific activities back to Murkoff's central authority. When scandals break, they attach to subsidiary companies that can be sacrificed without damaging the parent corporation. When lawsuits are filed, they get settled through structures that prevent discovery of broader patterns. The corporate form provides the same benefits that classification did during the Cold War. It makes accountability nearly impossible while allowing operations to continue, regardless of individual consequences. Mount Massive remains Murkoff's primary research facility throughout this transition. The asylum provides continuity, housing decades of accumulated data, and maintaining programs that can't be replicated elsewhere, without rebuilding infrastructure and expertise that took years to develop. But Murkoff diversifies, establishing operations in multiple locations that allow them to distribute risk and expand their research portfolio. The corporation also cultivates relationships with government agencies, law enforcement, and correctional systems that provide steady streams of potential subjects. Murkoff positions itself as a provider of specialized services for populations that other institutions struggle to manage: prisoners with severe mental illness, veterans with treatment-resistant PTSD, individuals committed through civil procedures who pose risks that psychiatric hospitals aren't equipped to handle. These are people who've already been deemed problematic by society, whose disappearance into Murkoff facilities won't trigger the same scrutiny that would attach to ordinary citizens. This targeting of vulnerable populations continues the pattern established during MKUltra and Project Lathe. Murkoff has always relied on recruiting subjects whose social position makes them easy to exploit, and whose suffering can be dismissed or ignored by institutions that should provide protection. The corporate evolution doesn't change this fundamental dynamic. It just makes it more efficient by creating legal frameworks that make the exploitation appear legitimate. By the 2000s, Murkoff has perfected a business model where systematic harm generates profit. They're billing insurance companies and government programs for treatment they provide to patients who are simultaneously serving as research subjects in experiments they haven't consented to. They're developing medications through research that would be prohibited if conducted under academic oversight, then selling those medications to populations who have no idea about their origins. They're accumulating data on human psychology and neuroscience that gives them competitive advantages in multiple industries. The moral horror of this arrangement is that it's largely legal. Murkoff operates within regulatory frameworks that were designed for conventional medical research and psychiatric care, frameworks that assume good faith compliance and that lack mechanisms for detecting institutional bad actors who are deliberately exploiting loopholes and ambiguities. The corporation files the required paperwork, maintains the necessary documentation, and presents externally as a legitimate healthcare provider. The illegal experiments happen in spaces designed to be invisible, conducted on populations whose complaints won't be taken seriously, protected through classification and corporate structure. Mount Massive continues its operations throughout this period with minimal changes to its core programs. Wernicke remains obsessed with perfecting the morphogenic engine, processing subjects through dream therapy that's become even more refined through decades of iteration. The variant population grows as more subjects survive the experiments, but emerge too damaged to function independently. The underground laboratories expand, incorporating new technologies and pharmaceutical compounds as they become available. The visible asylum deteriorates. Murkoff minimizes spending on patient care and facility maintenance, investing instead in underground research programs that might produce breakthroughs worth billions. The above-ground wards become overcrowded and understaffed. Patients receive minimal treatment, warehoused in conditions that violate basic standards for psychiatric care. But regulatory oversight of psychiatric institutions is weak enough that Murkoff can operate for years without facing meaningful consequences for the visible neglect, let alone the invisible experiments. Staff turnover at Mount Massive is high. Most employees don't last more than a few years before the conditions drive them away, but there are always new hires willing to take positions at an institution that's become known in psychiatric circles as a place that will hire people with checkered backgrounds or minimal credentials. Murkoff doesn't need excellent staff for the visible asylum. They just need bodies to maintain the appearance of a functioning facility. The important work happens underground with hand-selected personnel who've been vetted for their willingness to participate in research that crosses every ethical boundary. Jeremy Blair becomes the executive overseeing Mount Massive's operations sometime in the late 2000s. Blair represents a new generation of Murkoff leadership, people who weren't involved in the Cold War programs but who have been raised within corporate cultures that normalized what those programs created. Blair doesn't need to be convinced that experimenting on psychiatric patients is acceptable. He's internalized the logic that profits justify harms as long as the harms can be hidden or legally defended. Under Blair's oversight, Mount Massive accelerates toward the catastrophe that's been building for decades. He pushes Wernicke to produce results, to finally create a functional Walrider host that can be demonstrated to potential buyers. He authorizes increased processing of subjects through the morphogenic engine despite mounting evidence that the failure rate is destroying more people than ever. He implements cost-cutting measures that further degrade conditions in the visible asylum while redirecting resources to underground programs. This pressure produces the circumstances that will lead to William Hope becoming the first stable Walrider host in September 2013. But it also creates conditions where institutional control becomes tenuous. The variant population is larger and more unstable than Mount Massive's security can reliably contain. The staff in underground laboratories are overworked and desensitized to the point where safety protocols are routinely violated. The asylum itself is on the edge of systemic failure, held together through Murkoff's willingness to accept increasingly dangerous conditions as long as research continues. What nobody at Murkoff fully anticipates is that creating a functional Walrider host means creating something with the power to destroy the institution that made it. William Hope isn't just a person merged with nanotechnology. He's a consciousness that's been tortured into madness, given control over a weapon that can manifest anywhere and kill anything, and pointed at the people responsible for what was done to him. When Billy achieves lateral ascension and becomes the Walrider's host, the first thing he does is turn that power against Murkoff. The Mount Massive incident in September 2013 represents institutional evil consuming itself, Everything Murkoff built across decades, all the expertise they accumulated, the technology they developed, the control systems they perfected, it all becomes irrelevant when the weapon they created decides its makers are the enemy. Billy doesn't rampage randomly. The Walrider targets Murkoff's staff systematically, killing doctors and security personnel while releasing the variant population to wreak their own revenge on an institution that destroyed them. The massacre lasts for days. Murkoff sends tactical teams to contain the situation, but conventional weapons are useless against a nano swarm that can move through walls and reconstitute after being dispersed. The variants, freed from pharmaceutical restraints and driven by years of accumulated rage, hunt down every staff member they can find. The asylum becomes a slaughterhouse where the power dynamics that defined Mount Massive for decades are violently reversed. Miles Upshur, a journalist who receives a tip from a whistleblower inside Mount Massive, arrives during the incident and documents what he finds. His footage captures the aftermath of Murkoff's decades of research. The variants with their grotesque physical alterations, the underground laboratories designed for systematic torture disguised as therapy, the morphogenic engine still running with subjects trapped in its machinery, the evidence of institutional atrocity on a scale that should trigger criminal prosecution. But Miles doesn't escape to publish his findings. The Walrider kills him eventually, though not before Billy transfers the nano swarm to Miles's body, making him the new host. Miles becomes what Billy was, a consciousness merged with a weapon, trapped inside Mount Massive until Murkoff can figure out how to contain or destroy what they created. Murkoff's response to the Mount Massive incident reveals everything about how institutions protect themselves. They don't admit what happened. They classify the entire event, invoking national security to prevent investigation. They contain the physical site, preventing journalists or regulators from accessing the asylum. They develop cover stories about fires or structural failures that necessitated evacuation. They threaten or pay off anyone who might talk. The corporation survives what should have destroyed it. The Mount Massive incident becomes another scandal that Murkoff weathers through the same strategies they used after the Diphosgene affair. Acknowledge limited wrongdoing, sacrifice visible perpetrators, while protecting institutional leadership, pay settlements that include non-disclosure agreements, and wait for public attention to move elsewhere. Jeremy Blair dies during the incident, killed by the Walrider in footage Miles captured, but Blair's death doesn't constitute accountability. He wasn't prosecuted. He wasn't publicly exposed as responsible for decades of experiments on unwilling subjects. He just died, and Murkoff issues statements about tragic losses of dedicated employees during an incident they can't discuss due to ongoing investigations that will never conclude. The pattern holds. Institutions survive what destroys individuals. Murkoff continues operating because the corporate structure provides immunity that people don't have. The research continues because the knowledge accumulated over decades is too valuable to abandon. The victims remain invisible because classification and legal settlements prevent their stories from reaching audiences that might demand justice. Chapter 4. The Psychology of Ordinary Monsters. Mount Massive should have ended Murkoff. The footage Miles Upshur captured documented institutional atrocity that demands prosecution, but the footage never reaches the public, and this failure reveals something more disturbing than the experiments themselves: how thoroughly ordinary people become complicit in systematic evil without ever thinking of themselves as perpetrators. Hannah Arendt coined the phrase "the banality of evil" after watching Adolf Eichmann's trial in 1961. She expected to find a monster. What she discovered was a middle manager, someone motivated by career advancement rather than ideology, who processed logistics for genocide while thinking of himself as a competent administrator doing his job. Eichmann wasn't exceptionally cruel. He was exceptionally thoughtless, executing orders without engaging the moral reasoning that would have forced him to confront what those orders meant. Murkoff operates on this principle scaled to corporate structure. The corporation doesn't need to recruit sadists for most positions. They need people who can compartmentalize, who can focus on specific technical tasks without thinking deeply about what those tasks contribute to, who can rationalize their participation through frameworks that preserve their self-image as decent people just trying to make a living. Consider the lab technician at Mount Massive who prepares pharmaceutical compounds for the morphogenic engine. She has a degree in chemistry. She follows protocols for measuring and mixing substances. She documents results according to standard research procedures. Her daily experience is that she's conducting legitimate scientific work, operating sophisticated equipment, contributing to advances in neuroscience that might eventually help people with treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions. What she doesn't see, because institutional structure prevents her from seeing, is the subject, strapped into the morphogenic engine, while her compounds induce dream states where consciousness dissolves into horror. She doesn't witness the tumors growing as nanite production destroys cellular structures. She doesn't hear the screaming or see the bodies wheeled out when experiments fail catastrophically. Her work is separated from consequences by architecture and hierarchy, creating psychological distance that makes participation feel morally neutral. This is what psychologist Albert Bandura calls moral disengagement, the psychological processes that allow otherwise ethical people to engage in harmful behavior without experiencing the guilt or self-condemnation that would normally prevent such actions. Bandura identified several mechanisms through which this disengagement operates, and Murkoff's institutional structure activates every single one. Moral justification reframes harmful conduct as serving worthy purposes. The lab technician believes she's advancing medical science, contributing to treatments that will help future patients, participating in important work that serves the greater good. The fact that her compounds are being used to torture psychiatric patients gets obscured by framing that emphasizes research objectives rather than methods. She's helping develop treatments for PTSD, not enabling experiments that deliberately induce trauma. The language sanitizes the reality. Euphemistic labeling masks the true nature of actions through sanitized terminology. Subjects aren't torture victims, they're experimental population receiving morphogenic engine therapy. They're not being destroyed, they're undergoing intensive treatment protocols. They're not screaming in agony. They're displaying expected stress responses to therapeutic intervention. Every element of the operation gets described in clinical language that strips away moral weight, making atrocity sound like standard medical procedure. Advantageous comparison makes harmful actions seem acceptable by contrasting them with worse alternatives. Murkoff employees convince themselves they're preventing greater harms. If we don't develop these conditioning techniques, enemies of the state will do it first and use them against us. If we don't experiment on psychiatric patients, we'll never find treatments for conditions that cause immense suffering. The real harm happening now gets justified through hypothetical worse outcomes that participation supposedly prevents. Displacement of responsibility occurs when people view themselves as agents executing others' decisions, rather than morally accountable actors making their own choices. The lab technician follows protocols designed by senior researchers. She's implementing treatment plans approved by institutional review boards. She's just doing her job, following orders, executing the technical tasks she was hired to perform. The responsibility belongs to whoever designed the protocols, whoever approved the research, whoever decided these experiments should happen. She's just the instrument. Diffusion of responsibility spreads accountability across so many people that no individual feels personally responsible for outcomes. The experiments at Mount Massive require dozens of personnel. researchers designing protocols, technicians preparing compounds, nurses monitoring subjects, security staff restraining violent patients, administrators processing paperwork, maintenance staff cleaning the laboratories. Each person performs a small piece of a larger operation, and each can rationalize that their specific contribution isn't what's causing harm. Someone else is making the important decisions. Someone else is doing the really terrible things. I'm just mixing chemicals, just following checklists, just maintaining equipment. Research on diffusion of responsibility shows it's not merely a post hoc rationalization, but an online cognitive process that reduces how people experience agency over outcomes. When responsibility is shared, the neural processing of action consequences changes. The brain literally registers outcomes as less significant, less connected to personal agency, less requiring of moral evaluation. The presence of other agents automatically weakens the psychological linkage between what you do and what happens as a result. Murkoff's corporate structure maximizes this effect. No single person sees the complete operation. Information is compartmentalized so that technical staff don't witness the human consequences of their work, so that administrators processing a recruitment don't know what happens to the people they hire, so that everyone can focus on their specific function without confronting the broader horror they're collectively creating. The compartmentalization isn't accidental. It's designed specifically to prevent the kind of comprehensive awareness that would make moral disengagement impossible. Disregarding or distorting consequences allows people to minimize the harm their actions cause. If you don't directly witness suffering, it becomes psychologically easier to deny or downplay. The lab technician doesn't see the variants with their grotesque physical alterations. She doesn't encounter the subjects who emerge from the morphogenic engine with their minds shattered, beyond any possibility of recovery. She hears statistics about complications and adverse events, abstract numbers that don't carry the emotional weight of seeing actual destroyed human beings. The institutional structure keeps consequences invisible, allowing her to maintain psychological distance from what her compounds enable. Dehumanization strips victims of qualities that would normally evoke empathy and moral concern. Psychiatric patients at Mount Massive aren't presented as fully human with their own experiences, relationships, and value. They're presented as case studies, as diagnostic categories, as research subjects whose mental illness has already diminished their personhood in ways that make experimenting on them more acceptable. The experimental population designation itself is dehumanizing, reducing people to raw material for scientific investigation, making it easier for staff to treat them as objects rather than persons. Attribution of blame makes victims responsible for their own suffering. Murkoff's recruitment materials emphasize that subjects volunteered, that they signed consent forms, that they're receiving compensation for participation. The fact that consent was coerced through economic desperation, that subjects didn't understand what they were agreeing to, that compensation is meaningless when you're destroyed. All of this gets obscured by framing that makes victims appear complicit in their own harm. They chose to come here. They agreed to the protocols. If they're suffering, it's because they made bad decisions or couldn't handle the training. These mechanisms operate simultaneously, creating a comprehensive psychological framework that neutralizes moral reasoning. The lab technician doesn't need to consciously decide that torturing psychiatric patients is acceptable. She never formulates the question in those terms. The institutional structure provides her with interpretive frameworks that prevent her from recognizing what she's participating in, that allow her to maintain her self-image as an ethical person contributing to legitimate research while her daily actions enable systematic atrocity. This is what makes institutional evil so persistent and so difficult to oppose. It doesn't require monsters. It requires normal people who accept institutional framing without examining it too closely, who focus on their immediate tasks without thinking deeply about broader implications, who prioritize keeping their jobs over asking uncomfortable questions about what those jobs involve. Most Murkoff employees aren't individually cruel. They're collectively enabling cruelty through aggregated thoughtlessness, through accepting roles in systems whose full nature they avoid comprehending. The few who do recognize what's happening face a different psychological challenge. Once you understand that you're participating in institutional evil, continuing participation requires conscious, moral choice in ways it didn't before. You can no longer claim ignorance. You can no longer rely on institutional framing to insulate you from awareness of what your work enables. You're forced to choose between your career and your conscience, between the stability of your current position and the disruption that would come from refusing to continue. Most people in this situation choose to keep working. The psychological pressure to rationalize continuation is enormous. Quitting won't stop the experiments. Someone else will just fill your position. You have bills to pay, family depending on your income, career investments you've made that would be wasted if you walk away. Maybe you can do more good by staying and trying to minimize harm from inside the system. Maybe the situation isn't as bad as it appears. Maybe you're misunderstanding. Maybe there are justifications you're not aware of that make this defensible. These rationalizations work because they address genuine concerns. Quitting often doesn't stop institutional harm. Individual moral stands frequently accomplish nothing except sacrificing the person who makes them. The choice between complicity and unemployment is genuinely difficult when you have dependents, when you're not independently wealthy, when job markets in your field are tight, and having resigned for ethical reasons on your record makes you difficult to hire. But the cumulative effect of everyone making this calculation is that institutions conducting atrocity never lack for personnel. There's always someone willing to take the job, to follow the protocols, to not ask too many questions because they need the paycheck or the career advancement or the opportunity to work on technically interesting problems regardless of the moral context. The individual rationality of each person's decision creates collective irrationality, where systematic evil continues because nobody feels individually responsible for stopping it. Jeremy Blair represents the next level of complicity. As executive overseeing Mount Massive's operations, Blair can't claim ignorance about what the facility does. He's read the reports, he's seen the casualty numbers, he knows Wernicke is processing subjects through experiments that destroy most of them while producing minimal research value. Blair can't hide behind technical role limitations or compartmentalized information. He has comprehensive awareness and direct authority to shut down programs, but Blair is a product of corporate culture that has thoroughly normalized what Murkoff does. He grew up professionally in environments where quarterly results matter more than human costs, where operational efficiency is the primary virtue, where asking whether something should be done is less important than asking whether it can be done profitably. His psychology isn't sadistic, it's pragmatic in the most grotesque sense. He views human subjects as resources to be managed, experiments as investments that need to yield returns, casualties as acceptable costs of doing business. This represents a different form of moral disengagement, one that doesn't rely on avoiding awareness, but on reframing awareness through economic logic that treats ethics as constraint to be worked around, rather than as genuine limitation on acceptable conduct. Blair knows Mount Massive is torturing people. He's restructured his psychological relationship to that knowledge so it registers as morally neutral information, equivalent to knowing that factories produce waste or that mining operations disturb landscapes. Harm is just an externality, a cost imposed on parties who lack the power to refuse, something to be managed to avoid scandal, rather than something to be prevented because it's wrong. This isn't thoughtlessness like Eichmann. It's calculated thoughtfulness directed entirely toward institutional benefit, without concern for anyone outside the decision-making apparatus. Blair thinks constantly about Mount Massive's operations. He strategizes, he problem solves, he makes complex decisions about resource allocation and risk management. He's intelligent and engaged. His moral failure isn't absence of thought, but presence of thoughts, organized entirely around corporate success, with human welfare entering his considerations only when it affects public relations or legal liability. When Mount Massive collapses and Billy Hope uses the Walrider to massacre everyone inside, Blair's psychology becomes visible through his final actions. He doesn't evacuate. He doesn't try to save staff or patients. He attempts to preserve the research, to secure documentation, to prevent evidence from reaching investigators who might use it against Murkoff. His priorities remain institutional rather than humanitarian, even as people are dying around him. The corporation matters more than the lives, even when one of those lives is his own. This is where individual psychology intersects with institutional structure to create monsters who don't recognize themselves as monstrous. Blair isn't uniquely evil. He's a product of selection and socialization processes that identify people whose psychology makes them useful to institutions that profit from harm. Murkoff didn't need to corrupt Blair. They just needed to recruit someone who was already organized around the values corporate advancement requires, someone whose moral reasoning was already structured to prioritize institutional success over competing concerns about human welfare. The corporation cultivates this psychology deliberately. The people who get promoted within Murkoff are those who demonstrate ability to make hard decisions without getting sentimental about consequences for populations Murkoff exploits. The people who hesitate, who express concerns about subject welfare, who prioritize ethics over efficiency, they get pushed out or stuck in positions where they can't affect policy. The institutional culture rewards exactly the kind of pragmatic amorality that Blair represents, creating leadership that shares his psychology and that reproduces it in new hires through modeling and explicit instruction about what the company values. This creates self-perpetuating systems where institutional evil doesn't require ongoing intervention from particularly cruel individuals. The structure itself selects for and cultivates the psychology it needs. People who would be uncomfortable with Murkoff's operations self-select out during recruitment or early employment when they recognize the moral compromises involved. People who remain either successfully deploy moral disengagement mechanisms that allow them to avoid recognizing what they're part of, or they're people like Blair whose moral reasoning was already organized in ways compatible with corporate amorality. Temple Gate demonstrates these dynamics operating at community scale. The radio towers broadcasting signals that induce psychosis aren't maintained by fanatics who believe they're doing God's work. They're maintained by technicians who think they're running communications infrastructure, by engineers who troubleshoot equipment failures without understanding what the equipment does to human consciousness, by corporate personnel who process requisition orders and budget allocations for a facility whose true purpose is obscured through layers of classification and euphemistic documentation. The people operating those towers aren't present at Temple Gate. They don't see Noth murdering infants. They don't witness the sexual violence or the gradual descent into collective madness. They're separated by physical distance and by institutional structure that prevents them from connecting their technical work to human consequences. They're conducting equipment maintenance. They're optimizing signal transmission. They're solving interesting technical problems while remaining deliberately ignorant about why those problems need solving or what happens when they're solved successfully. This represents Murkoff's evolution toward maximally distributed atrocity. The corporation has learned that the more separation they can create between personnel, and consequences, the more sustainable their operations become. Templegate runs for over 4 decades partially because nobody working for Murkoff needs to witness the horror directly. The monitoring is conducted through surveillance equipment that reduces suffering to data streams. The decision-making happens in corporate offices hundreds of miles away, where quarterly reports don't include photographs of murdered children or transcripts of Noth's increasingly deranged sermons. The few people who do have comprehensive awareness, people in Easterman's position who understand the full scope of what Murkoff does, represent a different psychological category. These are individuals whose entire professional identity is invested in the research, who've built careers spanning decades around projects that require systematic harm to advance, who've sacrificed any conventional moral framework to achieve recognition in domains where conventional ethics would be disqualifying. Easterman doesn't need moral disengagement mechanisms. He's transformed his relationship to the research into something resembling aesthetic appreciation. The techniques for breaking human consciousness are beautiful to him, in the way elegant mathematical proofs are beautiful to mathematicians. The suffering is data, patterns to be recognized and refined. He's not avoiding awareness of consequences. He's engaging with consequences as the object of his professional fascination, studying how minds break and what can be built from the fragments with the detachment of a watchmaker studying mechanisms. This represents a form of evil that's harder to explain through standard psychological frameworks about moral disengagement. Easterman isn't disengaged. He's engaged completely, just without the empathy that would make that engagement morally constraining. His psychology suggests either profound developmental damage that prevented normal empathy from forming, or such complete professional socialization that his sense of self became entirely fused with institutional objectives in ways that erased any moral reasoning independent of those objectives. Either way, Murkoff depends on having a few people like Easterman in positions where comprehensive awareness is unavoidable. These are the institutional priests who maintain ideological commitment to research programs that require atrocity, who provide continuity across leadership changes, who train new generations of researchers in techniques that can only be learned through doing things no ethical framework permits. They're rare, but institutions that profit from systematic harm need them in sufficient numbers to staff critical positions where moral disengagement wouldn't be sufficient protection against the full horror of what those positions require. The result is a multi-tiered system where different levels of awareness require different psychological accommodations. Most Murkoff employees operate with minimal awareness, protected by compartmentalization and moral disengagement. Mid-level managers like facility directors have partial awareness they manage through pragmatic amorality and economic framing. Senior researchers like Easterman have comprehensive awareness they've transformed into professional identity that makes suffering into beauty. And at the very top, corporate leadership maintains strategic awareness they protect through such extreme separation from operational details that they can truthfully claim not to know specifics while directing the broader programs that create those specifics. This architecture makes accountability nearly impossible. When scandal breaks and investigators try to determine who's responsible, they find technical staff who genuinely didn't understand what they were part of, mid-level managers who were following corporate policy, senior researchers who can claim institutional review, board approval for their protocols, and executives who maintained plausible deniability about specific operations. Nobody made explicit decisions to torture people. Everyone just optimized their specific function within systems whose collective output was systematic atrocity. This is institutional evil at its most sophisticated. It doesn't require extraordinary cruelty from individuals. It requires ordinary people making ordinary calculations about their careers and their duties. about what they need to notice and what they can safely ignore, about which thoughts to think and which to avoid, because thinking them would make continued participation impossible. Murkoff has spent 8 decades refining these systems, learning exactly how to structure operations so that personnel can participate without unbearable psychological cost, so that atrocity becomes just another job that people show up to perform before going home to families they genuinely love. And this is why Murkoff survives while individuals who commit similar harms face prosecution. Individual crimes require individual intent, specific decisions to harm that can be proven in court. Institutional crimes distribute intent so thoroughly that proving individual culpability becomes nearly impossible, even when thousands of people are demonstrably harmed, and even when those harms clearly result from organizational policies and practices. The corporate form has evolved to exploit this gap between moral reality and legal framework, creating immunity through complexity that individuals could never access. Chapter 5. What conditioning actually does to the brain. The trials at Sinala aren't just traumatic experiences that subjects eventually recover from. They're carefully engineered to exploit specific neurological vulnerabilities that make certain kinds of psychological damage permanent. Understanding what Murkoff actually does to people requires understanding memory reconsolidation, a process that neuroscience discovered in the early 2000s, but that intelligence agencies and corporations have been weaponizing for decades. Memory doesn't work the way most people think. We imagine memories as stable recordings, like files stored on a hard drive that remain unchanged unless deliberately deleted. The reality is far stranger and more vulnerable to manipulation. Every time you recall a memory, you don't simply access a stored recording. You reconstruct it, pulling together fragments from different neural systems, interpreting those fragments through your current emotional state and beliefs, and then restoring the reconstructed version. This process is called reconsolidation, and it creates a window of vulnerability where memories can be altered or destroyed. The pharmaceutical compounds Murkoff developed through decades of experimentation at Mount Massive and Sinala are designed to exploit this window. When reagents are forced through trials that create intense traumatic memories, they're simultaneously given drugs that enhance memory consolidation, ensuring those experiences encode deeply into long-term storage. But when they return to the sleep room and hear Easterman's broadcasts reinterpreting what happened, they're given different compounds that make memories susceptible to modification during reconsolidation. The result is that reagents don't remember the trials accurately. They remember pharmaceutical-assisted reconstructions where Murkoff's interpretive frameworks have been literally encoded into the neural representation of what happened. The emotional salience of trauma remains. The physiological stress responses persist, but the cognitive interpretation gets rewritten. What should be remembered as torture becomes remembered as training. What should trigger resistance becomes associated with compliance. The memory itself becomes a weapon Murkoff installed inside the victim's consciousness. This isn't metaphor. Functional MRI studies on PTSD patients show that memory reconsolidation interventions can reduce amygdala activation when traumatic memories are recalled, diminishing the emotional intensity without erasing the memory's existence. Murkoff's research took this finding and inverted it. Instead of reducing trauma to help patients heal, they're using reconsolidation to preserve trauma's emotional intensity while changing how that trauma gets interpreted, creating psychological states where suffering reinforces compliance rather than motivating resistance. The sleep room serves this function specifically. Reagents return there between trials, exhausted and desperate for rest. The environment is designed to induce the semi-conscious state where memory reconsolidation happens most readily, neither fully awake nor deeply asleep. The broadcasts provide new interpretations precisely when the brain is most vulnerable to incorporating those interpretations into memory structures. The pharmaceutical compounds circulating in their systems ensure that what they hear gets encoded with the same neural emphasis as the original traumatic experience. Over repeated cycles of trauma followed by reconsolidation manipulation, reagents lose the ability to maintain coherent sense of what actually happened to them. Their memories become contaminated with Murkoff's framing to the point where they can't distinguish which thoughts originated from their own experience and which were installed through conditioning. This isn't confusion that can be cleared up through careful reflection. The contamination is neurological, embedded in the physical structure of how memories are stored and retrieved. This explains why reagents who escape Sinala struggle to report what happened coherently. They're not lying or exaggerating or suffering from simple PTSD. Their memories have been actively corrupted through processes designed to make those memories unreliable as evidence. When they try to explain that they were tortured, parts of their brain insist they volunteered for beneficial training. When they try to describe specific harms, the reconsolidated memories include justifications and reframings that make the narrative sound confused or contradictory. Murkoff has weaponized memory itself, turning victims' own recall processes into mechanisms that protect the corporation from accountability. The trials also induce learned helplessness, a psychological state that Martin Seligman first identified in the 1960s through experiments that would never pass modern ethics review. Seligman exposed dogs to electric shocks they couldn't escape or prevent. After sufficient exposure, the dogs stopped trying to escape even when escape became possible. They had learned through repeated experience that their actions didn't affect outcomes, creating a generalized belief that they were powerless to change their circumstances. The ethical problems with Seligman's original research are obvious, but the findings were real and have been replicated extensively. Learned helplessness produces measurable changes in brain chemistry, particularly in serotonin and norepinephrine systems that regulate motivation and mood. The experience of being unable to control negative outcomes literally changes how the brain processes possibility and agency. People who develop learned helplessness don't just feel unmotivated. They experience neurological states where the very concept of effective action becomes difficult to maintain. Every trial at Sinala is designed to induce this state. Reagents are placed in situations where they're told to complete objectives, while prime assets apply continuous pressure that makes completion nearly impossible. When they fail, they're punished. When they succeed, the objectives change, or the promised relief doesn't materialize. The structure teaches through direct experience that effort is futile, that outcomes are determined by institutional authority rather than by their own actions, that the only rational response to suffering is acceptance rather than resistance. Coyle's electrical torture is particularly effective at inducing learned helplessness because pain operates on neurological circuits that bypass conscious reasoning. When the stun baton sparks and current runs through your body, your brain doesn't engage in cost-benefit analysis about whether you should comply. It experiences overwhelming imperative to make the pain stop through any means available. If compliance stops the pain temporarily, neural reward systems encode that association. If resistance intensifies the pain, those same systems encode that trying to fight back makes things worse. Over repeated exposures, the brain learns at a level below conscious thought that obedience reduces suffering and resistance increases it. This learning isn't accessible to rational override because it's encoded in evolutionarily ancient circuits that develop to protect organisms from immediate physical threats. You can't think your way out of learned helplessness any more than you can think your way out of flinching when something moves toward your face. The response becomes automatic, triggered before consciousness can evaluate whether it's appropriate. Franco's approach works through different mechanisms but toward the same end. Instead of physical pain, he weaponizes guilt and religious frameworks that make victims complicit in their own punishment. The devil's therapy forces reagents to confess sins, then punishes them for confessing, creating psychological loops where there's no safe action. If you confess, you're punished for being guilty. If you refuse to confess, you're punished for defiance. The only way to reduce suffering is to accept Franco's judgment as legitimate, to internalize the belief that you deserve punishment, that your suffering serves purposes beyond your comprehension. This produces learned helplessness through cognitive rather than purely physical pathways. But the neurological result is similar. The brain learns that outcomes are determined by external authority, that your own moral reasoning is irrelevant or actively harmful, that the only rational response is to surrender judgment to figures who claim the right to define reality. This is precisely the psychological state that authoritarian systems require from populations they want to control. People who've lost the sense that they can effectively resist, who've learned through direct experience that resistance brings worse consequences than compliance, who've internalized the interpretations authority provides because maintaining their own interpretations just creates additional suffering. Mother Gooseberry's unpredictability adds another dimension by preventing reagents from developing stable defensive strategies. If you could predict when punishment would come or what behaviors would trigger it, you could maintain some sense of agency through learning the rules and following them. But when authority figures switch unpredictably between nurturing and violent, between reasonable and delusional, there are no safe rules to learn. Every interaction becomes a gamble where the odds are controlled by factors you can't observe or understand. This variable reinforcement schedule creates stronger conditioning than consistent punishment or consistent reward. Behavioral psychology has known since the 1930s that intermittent reinforcement produces responses that are most resistant to extinction. Slot machines exploit this, giving wins at unpredictable intervals that keep people playing far longer than they would if they never won or if they won every time. Mother Gooseberry's dissociative shifts exploit the same principle, creating psychological investment in trying to please her, even though success is fundamentally unpredictable. The cumulative effect of these mechanisms operating simultaneously across multiple trials is that reagents develop what trauma researchers call complex PTSD. This isn't the single incident trauma of combat veterans or assault survivors. It's the systematic, repeated trauma of captivity situations like hostage scenarios or domestic abuse, where escape is impossible and where the victim's entire reality becomes organized around their relationship to the perpetrator. Complex PTSD produces alterations in identity and emotional regulation that go beyond the hypervigilance and intrusive memories of standard PTSD. Victims develop patterns of dissociation where they mentally absent themselves from experiences that are too overwhelming to process. They struggle with emotional regulation, swinging between numbness and overwhelming affect without the gradations of feeling that allow normal people to navigate social situations. They experience disrupted sense of identity, struggling to maintain coherent sense of who they are, separate from the trauma and the perpetrator. Most damagingly, they develop altered systems of meaning where their previous beliefs about how the world works have been shattered and replaced with frameworks provided by the traumatizing institution. They can't return to their prior worldview because that worldview has been demonstrated to be false through direct experience. The belief that people have rights that protect them from institutional abuse becomes impossible to maintain when institutions have systematically violated those rights without consequence. The belief that suffering is proportional to guilt becomes untenable when punishment is arbitrary and inescapable. Murkoff creates these states deliberately because people whose meaning systems have collapsed are maximally vulnerable to accepting new frameworks that make sense of their suffering. The sleep room broadcasts provide those frameworks, offering interpretations that allow reagents to construct narratives where what happened to them wasn't meaningless torture but transformation for important purposes. The alternative is accepting that they've been destroyed for no reason except corporate profit, that their suffering served no legitimate purpose, that they're victims of institutional evil they can't effectively oppose. That acceptance is psychologically unbearable for most people. The brain will accept almost any interpretation that provides meaning rather than confront meaninglessness. This is the deepest level of what Murkoff does to people. They don't just break them, they break them in ways that make victims prefer Murkoff's interpretations to accurate understanding of what was done to them. They create psychological states where the truth is more damaging than the lie, where maintaining awareness of victimization is more painful than accepting the conditioning. The victim's own survival mechanisms become weapons Murkoff uses to ensure compliance even after direct control ends. Chapter 6: Surveillance Capitalism. Temple Gate represents Murkoff's discovery that similar effects can be achieved through environmental manipulation rather than direct captivity. The radio towers broadcasting signals that induce psychosis demonstrate a principle that should terrify anyone living in the modern technological environment. Consciousness can be influenced at scale through infrastructure that populations don't recognize as doing anything except providing services they've come to depend on. The towers look like communications equipment. They're presented as technology for improving connectivity, for bringing modern conveniences to remote communities, for enabling economic development through better infrastructure. Nobody at Temple Gate understands they're being subjected to experimental manipulation because the technology doing the manipulating is camouflaged as something benign and necessary. This represents evolution toward what scholar Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, economic systems where human experience is treated as raw material to be captured, analyzed, and modified for profit. Zuboff's research documents how technology corporations have built business models around capturing behavioral data and using that data to predict and influence future behavior. Search engines don't just return results, they're experiments that test which results generate which user behaviors, accumulating knowledge about psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited through targeted manipulation. Social media platforms don't just connect people, they're conditioning environments that shape beliefs and behaviors through carefully calibrated feedback mechanisms users don't consciously recognize as manipulation. The difference between Murkoff and contemporary tech corporations is primarily one of sophistication rather than kind. Murkoff uses crude microwave transmissions to induce psychosis. Tech platforms use algorithmic feeds to induce rage, anxiety, and compulsive engagement. Murkoff processes subjects through physical trials that traumatize them into compliance. Social media platforms process users through engagement loops that condition them to seek validation through metrics the platforms control. The mechanisms differ, but the underlying logic is identical. Human consciousness is raw material to be processed and shaped toward outcomes that serve institutional profit. Temple Gate demonstrates what becomes possible when this logic gets implemented through environmental infrastructure. The residents don't consent to being manipulated because they don't know manipulation is happening. They experience visions and religious revelations that feel authentic, that they interpret through their existing theological frameworks, never recognizing that what they're experiencing is being induced by technology. operated by people who view them as experimental subjects. This is surveillance capitalism's endpoint, where the boundary between authentic experience and manufactured experience dissolves completely because the technology shaping consciousness has become invisible. The modern Sinala facility represents a different approach to the same objective. Instead of hiding the conditioning entirely, Murkoff creates structure where subjects technically consent while being coerced by circumstances they didn't create and can't effectively resist. The recruitment targets people in desperate economic situations, people for whom the signing bonus and promised compensation represent the difference between housing stability and homelessness, between feeding their children and skipping meals. These aren't people with meaningful choice about whether to participate. They're people for whom refusal means accepting consequences so severe that participation becomes rational, even when they suspect something is wrong. This mirrors how contemporary economic systems generate consent for conditions that would be unacceptable if presented openly. You consent to workplace surveillance because refusing means unemployment in an economy where jobs are scarce. You consent to terms of service that give corporations ownership of your personal data because refusing means exclusion from platforms that have become necessary for social and economic participation. You consent to algorithmic manipulation because the alternative is disconnection from systems that increasingly mediate every aspect of social life. The consent is technically valid in legal terms. You signed the paperwork, you clicked the agreement, you weren't physically forced. But the framing obscures how thoroughly choice has been constrained by structural conditions that the institutions demanding consent created or exploit. This is manufactured consent on a scale that makes Noam Chomsky's analysis of media manipulation look almost quaint by comparison. We're not just being given misleading information about distant policy questions. We're being subjected to direct neurological and psychological manipulation through technologies we're economically coerced into depending on. The pharmaceutical interventions Murkoff developed represent another area where their research has bled into legitimate systems in ways most people don't recognize. The compounds they refined through experiments on captive populations have been rebranded as medications for anxiety and depression, prescribed to millions of people who have no idea those drugs were developed through systematic torture. The medications work in the sense that they produce neurological effects, but those effects were optimized for making people compliant and vulnerable to suggestion rather than for genuine therapeutic benefit. This raises disturbing questions about how much of contemporary psychiatric pharmacology is actually treatment versus how much is conditioning that's been medicalized. Antidepressants that reduce emotional range might help people suffering from debilitating affect, but they also make people easier to manage in workplaces and social systems that require compliance. Anxiolytics that reduce threat perception might help people with panic disorders, but they also make people less likely to recognize and resist genuinely threatening institutional actors. The effects that get classified as therapeutic versus side effects reflect value judgments about which psychological states institutions prefer, rather than neutral assessments of well-being. Murkoff's research suggests those value judgments were baked into pharmaceutical development from the beginning. The compounds were designed to produce psychological states useful for institutional control, then reframed as treatments for conditions that might actually be healthy responses to genuinely harmful circumstances. Maybe anxiety in the face of economic precarity isn't a disorder requiring medication. Maybe depression in response to meaningless work isn't brain chemistry malfunction. Maybe the appropriate treatment isn't drugs that make those responses less intense, but structural changes that would eliminate the circumstances producing them. But structural change threatens institutional interests in ways that pharmaceutical intervention doesn't. Medicating people to tolerate intolerable conditions preserves those conditions while generating profit for pharmaceutical corporations. Changing conditions would require admitting that institutions have been harming people, that power structures need dismantling, that the people benefiting from current arrangements need to accept losses. The path of least resistance is to frame resistance as pathology and offer pharmacological solutions that make pathology more bearable without addressing root causes. This is where Murkoff's influence becomes most insidious. They're not just one corporation conducting experiments, they've shaped entire frameworks through which contemporary societies understand and respond to psychological distress. The knowledge they generated through atrocity has been laundered through academic institutions and pharmaceutical companies, becoming the foundation for treatments that millions of people depend on without understanding those treatments' origins or questioning whether the conditions being treated are actually disorders versus rational responses to disordered systems. Chapter 7: Why Resistance Fails. The bleakness of Murkoff's story makes resistance feel futile. The corporation has survived 8 decades of scandals that should have destroyed it. Whistleblowers have failed to generate accountability. Victims struggle to report what happened coherently because the conditioning they received corrupts the memories they would use as evidence. The knowledge Murkoff accumulated has been so thoroughly integrated into legitimate systems that challenging specific applications means confronting frameworks entire societies depend on. Every structural factor suggests Murkoff will continue operating indefinitely, processing new victims, refining their techniques, expanding their influence. But futility isn't certainty. Institutional evil is resilient but not invincible. The factors that make Murkoff difficult to oppose also create vulnerabilities that resistance can exploit if sustained long enough and organized strategically enough. Understanding those vulnerabilities requires understanding what institutional evil actually needs to reproduce itself across time. First, it needs personnel willing to participate despite recognizing harm. Moral disengagement mechanisms are powerful but not absolute. The lab technician who successfully avoids thinking about what her compounds enable could encounter information that makes avoidance impossible. A colleague might share details that force comprehensive awareness. A whistleblower might circulate documents that make abstract harm concrete and personal. A family member might ask questions about her work that she can't answer without lying or admitting complicity. These moments where moral disengagement breaks down are dangerous for institutions. Someone who's been operating with compartmentalized awareness and suddenly achieves comprehensive understanding becomes a potential liability rather than an asset. They might quit, refuse to continue participating, even become a whistleblower themselves. The institution needs to identify and neutralize these individuals before they can act on their new awareness, through threats, payoffs, or psychological manipulation designed to restore comfortable ignorance. But neutralization requires resources and attention. Every person who achieves uncomfortable awareness creates management overhead. Every potential whistleblower requires surveillance and intervention. The more employees simultaneously experience moral disengagement failures, the more institutional capacity gets consumed managing internal dissent rather than conducting operations. This creates opportunity for resistance. If whistleblowers coordinate releases rather than acting individually, if they time disclosures to overwhelm Murkoff's capacity to manage multiple crises, the probability of meaningful exposure increases. Second, institutional evil needs victims who don't organize collectively. Individual survivors testifying about what happened can be dismissed as mentally ill, as having ulterior motives, as misremembering or exaggerating. But when dozens or hundreds of survivors coordinate testimony that corroborates despite coming from people who never met each other. The dismissals become harder to sustain. Pattern evidence is more powerful than individual accounts because it suggests systemic practice rather than isolated incidents. Murkoff prevents this coordination by dispersing survivors geographically, by conditioning them to distrust other survivors, and by using non-disclosure agreements to threaten legal consequences for anyone who shares information about their experiences. Breaking through this isolation requires survivors taking significant personal risks, violating agreements that might subject them to ruinous lawsuits, trusting people they've been conditioned to view as potential threats. But coordinated testimony has historical precedent for breaking through institutional protection. The Catholic Church abuse scandals weren't exposed through single victims coming forward. They were exposed through investigative journalists finding multiple victims in different locations who'd never communicated, but whose accounts displayed patterns that indicated systematic institutional failure. The #MeToo movement didn't succeed through individual accusations, but through accumulation of testimonies that made patterns undeniable. Murkoff is vulnerable to similar coordinated exposure if survivors can overcome the isolation and legal threats that prevent collective action. This requires resources to fight legal retaliation, platforms willing to publish despite corporate pressure, and audiences willing to believe testimony, even when it contradicts institutional assurances. These are significant barriers, but not insurmountable ones. Third, institutional evil needs public ignorance or apathy about its operations. Murkoff relies on most people not knowing what they do, not caring when they find out, or not believing though evidence is credible. This ignorance is maintained through complexity, through classification that prevents information from circulating, through media partnerships that ensure favorable coverage, and through the simple reality that most people have limited attention for problems that don't directly affect them. But moments of political possibility emerge when circumstances align to make previously ignored issues suddenly salient. Economic crises create receptivity to critiques of corporate power. Technological failures create skepticism about institutions' competence. Political scandals create willingness to believe that authorities lie systematically. These moments open space for information that would normally be dismissed or ignored to gain traction and generate momentum toward accountability. Resistance that wants to be strategic needs to archive evidence and maintain organizational capacity during periods when meaningful change seems impossible, so that when moments of political possibility arrive, the documentation exists to capitalize on them. This requires patience, resources, and willingness to continue working toward long-term objectives, even when short-term victories remain elusive. Fourth, institutional evil needs legal and regulatory frameworks that protect rather than constrain it. Murkoff operates through corporate structures that distribute responsibility, through classification that prevents investigation, through partnerships with government agencies that have interests in protecting them. But legal frameworks can change. Regulatory agencies can be restructured. Political administrations can decide that prosecuting corporate crimes serves their interests better than maintaining protective relationships. These changes don't happen spontaneously. They require sustained pressure from activists, journalists, prosecutors, and politicians willing to challenge corporate power despite the career risks and resource disadvantages involved. The pressure needs to be maintained across election cycles, across changes in public attention, across institutional resistance, designed to exhaust opposition through delays and procedural obstacles. But change becomes possible when enough actors simultaneously decide that the costs of allowing institutional evil to continue exceed the costs of confronting it. This calculation is fundamentally political rather than moral. Institutions don't reform because they recognize they're doing wrong. They reform when continuing current practices becomes more expensive or risky than changing them. Creating those conditions requires making Murkoff's operations expensive through lawsuits, protests, boycotts, and public campaigns that damaged their reputation. It requires making protection risky for government agencies and politicians who might face consequences if their relationships with Murkoff become public. It requires building coalitions across different constituencies who recognize that institutional evil threatens everyone, even when immediate victims are drawn from vulnerable populations. This is exhausting work that generates more failures than successes. Most lawsuits get dismissed or settled with non-disclosure agreements. Most protests change nothing except making participants feel they've done something. Most campaigns fail to generate sustained attention. But the cumulative effect of continued resistance, even failed resistance, is that institutions need to continuously spend resources managing opposition rather than directing those resources toward expanding operations. The resistance matters even when it fails, because failure that gets documented becomes evidence for future attempts. Every whistleblower who gets silenced leaves documentation that future investigators might use. Every lawsuit that gets dismissed establishes legal precedent that makes future prosecution slightly easier. Every protest that seems to accomplish nothing creates awareness that makes the next protest slightly larger. The institutional memory of resistance accumulates even when individual actions don't produce immediate victories. Chapter 8: Living in the World Murkoff Created. The hardest truth is that we're already living in the world Murkoff and institutions like them created. The conditioning techniques refined through decades of systematic torture are deployed through technologies we use daily. The pharmaceutical interventions developed on unwilling subjects circulate through populations who take them voluntarily. The frameworks for understanding psychological distress bear fingerprints of research programs designed to make people controllable rather than healthy. This doesn't mean resistance is futile. It means resistance needs to start from accurate understanding of how thoroughly institutional evil has been normalized, how deeply its logic has penetrated systems that present themselves as benign or beneficial. How many daily interactions involve forms of conditioning and manipulation that operate below conscious awareness? The attention economy functions through variable reinforcement schedules designed to keep you checking notifications even though most contain nothing valuable. The algorithmic feeds learn your psychological vulnerabilities and exploit them to maximize engagement, regardless of whether engagement serves your well-being. The targeted advertising uses behavioral prediction models to identify moments when you're most susceptible to impulse purchases. Every interaction trains you to respond in ways that serve corporate profit while feeling like autonomous choice. This is Murkoff's legacy: consciousness as battlefield where victory means making people believe they're free, while being systematically conditioned toward outcomes institutions determined. The conditioning is subtler than Sinala's trials, but operates on similar principles. Exploit neurological vulnerabilities, provide interpretive frameworks that make manipulation feel like preference, prevent awareness of being manipulated through complexity and invisible infrastructure. Resisting requires cultivating awareness of being manipulated even when the manipulation is designed to prevent that awareness. It requires building practices that create psychological distance from conditioning systems, not through complete withdrawal, but through maintaining skepticism about experiences that feel authentic but might be manufactured. It requires recognizing that many thoughts and preferences might not originate from autonomous self, but from conditioning environments we've been embedded in since birth. This awareness doesn't provide immunity. You can understand how notifications exploit variable reinforcement schedules and still feel compulsion to check them. You can recognize algorithmic manipulation and still find yourself scrolling through feeds that make you feel worse. The conditioning operates at levels below conscious control. in reward circuits that override rational understanding. But awareness creates possibility of choosing differently, even when choice is difficult. The person who understands they're being conditioned can make deliberate decisions about which conditioning to accept and which to resist. They can seek environments that provide alternative reinforcement structures. They can build communities organized around different values than maximizing engagement and profit. The choices available might be constrained, but they're not eliminated entirely. The long-term project is building institutions that don't depend on conditioning and manipulation to function, that can coordinate collective action without requiring psychological subordination of participants, that respect human autonomy as fundamental value rather than obstacle to overcome. This requires reimagining how power operates, how decisions get made, how resources get allocated. It requires political struggle that generations inherit and pass forward because the work won't be completed within any individual lifetime. Murkoff continues operating. The trials run without pause. New reagents arrive weekly, processed through systems refined across 8 decades of systematic destruction. The prime assets maintain their roles. Human weapons for whom cruelty has become identity itself. The sleep room broadcasts continue programming minds toward acceptance and compliance. But documentation accumulates. Survivors find each other despite isolation. Whistleblowers prepare disclosures for moments when political conditions might make them viable. Researchers study the mechanisms through which institutional evil operates. Journalists investigate despite legal threats. Activists maintain pressure despite constant setbacks. The resistance persists because the alternative is accepting that consciousness belongs to whoever has resources to capture and shape it. The story doesn't have resolution because the story is still happening. You're living inside it right now, navigating environments designed to condition you toward outcomes you might not choose if aware of the manipulation. Every institution you interact with has learned something from Murkoff's example about how to make harm feel normal, how to manufacture consent for conditions that serve institutional interests against human welfare, how to make people complicit in their own subordination. The question isn't whether you're being manipulated. You are. The question is whether you'll maintain awareness of that manipulation and resist it where possible, whether you'll build relationships and communities that create alternatives, whether you'll participate in political struggle toward institutions that don't require systematic harm to function. Those choices are constrained and difficult and might not succeed within your lifetime, but they're the only choices that acknowledge the reality we're living in and the possibility, however distant, that something different could be built. Murkoff is the monster that shows us what institutions become when freed from effective constraints, when profit becomes the only legitimate objective, when human welfare becomes relevant only when it affects public relations. The monster persists because we haven't built structures powerful enough to kill it, because the knowledge it accumulated is too valuable to abandon, because the people who benefit from its continued existence have more power than the people it destroys. But monsters are mortal. Institutions can be dismantled. Knowledge can be quarantined or rejected despite its utility. Power can shift when enough people simultaneously decide the costs of current arrangements exceed their benefits. None of this is inevitable. All of it requires work that most people won't do because the costs are high and the victories are uncertain. The story ends where it began. A person wakes on a bench outside a facility they don't remember entering. Metal goggles are drilled into their skull. A voice tells them they volunteered for something important. And the nightmare continues because institutions that profit from destroying consciousness have learned they can operate indefinitely as long as they're careful about which victims they choose and how thoroughly they control the narrative about what those victims experienced. Somewhere in the darkness, another trial begins. Another person learns that resistance is futile. Another mind gets processed into a weapon. And Murkoff endures because that's what institutional evil does when accountability fails and profits persist. And the world forgets to pay attention to people who disappear into places nobody talks about until it's too late to save them.